there's a quiet kind of mystery that surrounds the end of the dinosaurs. A silence that still echoes through the stones beneath our feet. A silence born from fire, from light, and from a moment that changed everything. But tonight, we're not here for the roar of impact or the chaos of destruction. We're here for what came after the long, slow exhale of a planet rediscovering itself. The quiet rebirth that followed the end of a world. So, as you settle in, perhaps lying in bed, eyes growing heavy, the hum of the night around you, take a deep breath. Let the past come to you like a slow tide. You're about to drift through time, 66 million years into the past, to see what the Earth became after the asteroid. And if you enjoy journeys like this, calm explorations through forgotten worlds, make sure you're subscribed, so you can return anytime to wander through history's quiet corners. Now, let's begin. The world ends not with a sound, but with a sigh. After the asteroid's fiery plunge through the atmosphere, after the light that turned the sky white and then blackened it with ash, there was a stillness so deep it felt like time itself had paused. The air was thick with smoke. The seas had turned a strange shade of grey-green, swirling with the remnants of soot and minerals from the impact. For weeks, the sun barely touched the surface of the planet. What light did reach through came faintly, filtered, dim, the color of brass through fog. Forests that once shimmered in tropical hues now stood like blackened silhouettes. Leaves curled and crumbled, turning to ash in the faint wind. The earth, for a time, became a shadow of itself, a place wrapped in its own aftermath. But beneath that heavy sky, something remarkable lingered. Life stubborn, silent, waiting. Small mammals, no bigger than a rat, hid in burrows and tree hollows. In the deep oceans, plankton drifted through layers of darkness, feeding on the faintest remnants of sunlight that slipped through the haze. Even among the fallen trees and burnt plains, seeds waited, tiny specks of green hope buried in black soil. This was the beginning of Earth's slow recovery, a time when survival meant patience, and patience, in the great history of life, is often the key to everything. Weeks became months. The dust in the sky began to settle, drawn down by rain thick with ash and soot, the color of slate. It fell in quiet rhythm across continents, pattering softly on what remained of the world. In that stillness, rivers began to flow again, carving their gentle paths through new layers of sediment, reshaping the land left broken by the asteroid's shockwaves. The climate was strange, cold at first, unnaturally so, a sudden winter that wrapped the earth in a grey chill. But beneath the surface, warmth stirred. Volcanoes still rumbled. The planet was restless, alive, and healing in its own unpredictable way. In the shadow of that cooling age, life began its slow and humble return. Imagine standing in what is now the heart of North America. The forests are gone, but the land is littered with charred remains of ferns, cycads, and towering trees that once stretched high into the humid sky. The smell of sulfur still clings faintly to the air, but in the soil, dark, damp, and rich with decasimal green shoots push upward. They tremble in the faint light, fragile yet determined. These are the pioneers of a new world, plants that thrive on what came before. Ferns, resilient and ancient, carpet the burned ground. They grow where fire has cleared the way, their delicate fronds catching dew from the morning fog. For centuries, ferns and mosses dominate this silent earth. Their quiet persistence turns blackened wastelands into soft green plains once again. And above them, the sky slowly lightens, the clouds thin, the sun returns, not yet as bright as before, but warm enough to stir life back into motion. In the oceans too, recovery begins. Slow and invisible beneath waves, still tinted grey. Plankton, microscopic and nearly immortal in their endurance, multiply once more. Their delicate shells drift in endless patterns, forming the first food chains of the new era. Tiny fish rise to feed on them, and soon, larger creatures follow. The rhythm of life, though faint, hums again through the deep. Yet this new world is not the same. The giants are gone. The thunder of the great reptiles has vanished. No more do the heavy steps of a tyrannosaur shake the ground. No more do herds of triceratops graze across endless plains. Their age has ended gently, completely. In their place, the small and the quiet begin to inherit the earth. Picture now a small mammal emerging from its burrow, its fur still matted with dust, its eyes bright against the gloom. It sniffs the air cautiously, every sense tuned to survival. For millions of years, its kind lived in shadow, beneath the feet of the mighty. Now, the world is theirs. They scurry across the soft earth, feeding on seeds, insects, and what little remains. Their world is colder, quieter, but freer. Each generation grows a bit larger, a bit bolder, and in time, they will evolve into creatures that will reshape the planet once again into us, eventually. But for now, the earth sleeps under a pale sun. The days are long and dim. The nights are silent, but for the winds whisper through the growing ferns. Even the air seems to hold its breath. It takes thousands of years for the forests to return. First the ferns, then small shrubs, then trees not the same as before, but new kinds born from change. Palm-like plants rise in the tropics. Hardy conifers claim the colder lands, and flowering plants, delicate, colorful, efficient, begin to spread across the continents, painting the land with soft hues of life once more. Birds, the distant descendants of dinosaurs, fill the skies again. Their songs are gentler now, lighter. Their ancestors ruled the air with power. These new creatures glide with grace, weaving through the branches of new forests. Everywhere, the scars of the impact slowly fade. The crater itself, vast and silent, becomes a lake. Rain fills its basin, layer by layer, turning the scar into something beautiful. New rivers trace the edges of what once was destruction, and around them, green life flourishes again, unaware of what had been lost. Time, patient and eternal, smooths even the roughest edges of catastrophe, and so, the earth moves forward, slowly, steadily, into a new age, an age, not of giants, but of survivors, an age of mammals, of forests reborn, of skies filled once more with flight. For all the fire and shadow, the world endures, and as you breathe softly now, perhaps imagining the quiet rustle of those first ferns, or the gentle lap of waves against a world reborn, you can feel it too, the slow, unbroken rhythm of life that never truly ends. The earth sleeps, it heals, and somewhere in that long and endless night, after the fall of fire, dawn begins again. Asterisk. When the dust finally began to settle and the long night began to wane, the earth took its first hesitant breaths of renewal. For tens of thousands of years, the atmosphere had been shrouded in ash, and sunlight barely touched the surface. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the skies began to lighten. The particles that had once kept the planet cloaked in cold darkness began to drift down through the layers of air, settling onto land and sea, coating everything in a fine grey powder, the quiet signature of a world that had survived its own ending. In this fragile dawn, the first green tendrils began to appear. At first, they were tiny, barely visible against the ashen soil, but with time, they spread mosses and ferns, small and hardy, pushing their way through the sediment of the old world. Rain fell again, gentle and warm, washing away the remnants of destruction. Rivers began to flow with clarity once more, carving new paths through the reshaped continents. The earth, in its resilience, was beginning to heal. And yet, it was a different planet now. The age of the giants, the colossal reptiles that once thundered across plains and swam through ancient seas, had passed. In their place, something quieter emerged. Tiny mammals, once hidden beneath ferns and roots, began to creep into the open. They had lived in the shadows of the dinosaurs, surviving by night, burrowing into the ground to escape the heat of the day or the predators above. But now, they had space to grow. They were small, nimble, and endlessly adaptable, and in their quiet persistence lay the foundation of what the earth would become. The forests that grew around them offered shelter. The rivers brought life. Insects returned to pollinate the new blossoms that painted the land with gentle colors. Birds, the last living remnants of the dinosaurs, filled the skies with fragile, uncertain songs. The world had been scarred, yes, but it had not been broken. And in that resilience, there was beauty. Millions of years passed, and the air warmed. Volcanoes still rumbled from time to time, reshaping coastlines and sending plumes of ash into the heavens. But the cycle of life had begun again in earnest. Forests of palm and magnolia covered the tropics. Mammals grew larger, finding new ways to move and live. Some took to the trees, leaping from branch to branch with soft furred bodies and long, grasping tails. Others roamed the forests, nibbling on fruits and tender leaves. The oceans, too, stirred with change. Where once giant reptiles had ruled, new creatures began to thrive. Small, sleek fish darted through coral reefs. Early whales, still bearing traces of their land-dwelling ancestors, began to explore the open seas. They would surface to breathe air before diving again into the cool depths. their haunting calls echoing through the water like ancient songs. In the silence of this new world, time stretched and softened. There was no rush, no urgency. The earth was healing at its own pace. The sunlight grew warmer, filtered through hazy clouds. Seasons began to form patterns once again, the rhythm of day and night, of growth and decay, of rain and renewal. All found their balance. Far to the north, the remnants of the old world lay buried beneath layers of sediment and ice. Great mountain ranges, slowly pushed upward by the shifting of continents, reached toward the sky. Rivers cut through stone, carrying minerals down into fertile valleys. The air grew fresher. The winds carried seeds across oceans, scattering life where once there had been only desolation. And with every passing millennium, the Earth's heartbeat grew stronger. Imagine walking through one of these forests millions of years ago. The air is heavy with the scent of damp soil and fresh leaves. The sound of insects hums all around you, gentle and rhythmic. Somewhere in the distance, a small mammal scurries across the forest floor, its fur glinting softly in the dappled light. The canopy above filters the sunlight into streams of gold and green. Every now and then, a drop of water falls from a leaf, landing softly in a pool below. The silence is alive, not empty, but filled with the quiet movements of a world rediscovering itself. And as centuries become millennia, new forms of life take shape. Mammals grow larger, more complex. Some begin to resemble the creatures we might recognize today. Primitive horses, no bigger than a house cat, wander through meadows of fern. Small primates swing through the branches, curious eyes watching the shifting world around them. Their hands, delicate and clever, grip branches and fruits with ease. These early ancestors of our own kind were part of the great experiment of life, testing shapes, habits, and possibilities in the long unfolding story of evolution. The climate, too, was shifting. The Earth was warmer than it would be in later ages, but it was stable enough to nurture abundance. Great wetlands stretched across continents. The air shimmered with moisture, carrying the scent of life and decay. And beneath the surface, tectonic plates continued their slow dance, shaping continents and seas into new patterns. The Atlantic Ocean widened, gently pulling the Americas away from Europe and Africa. Mountain chains rose where landmasses collided. The face of the planet was always changing, always breathing. Even in its silence, the Earth was never still. Every gust of wind carried traces of the world before dust from the old age of reptiles, mixed with the pollen of new flowers. The rain that fell was the same rain that had fallen since the dawn of time, recycled and reborn. In the deepest sense, nothing was ever truly lost. It merely changed form. As the Paleogene gave way to the Neogene, the world continued to flourish. Grasslands began to spread across the continents, their rolling waves of green shimmering under the sunlight. This was the beginning of a new kind of ecosystem, one that would soon support vast herds of grazing animals. The forests still remained, but open plains became more common, giving rise to new species that adapted to running and roaming. With the open land came new challenges. Predators evolved to match the speed and awareness of their prey. Early big cats began to emerge, their muscles sleek and powerful. Packs of hunting dogs roamed in silence. Mammals grew sharper in mind and movement. Survival became a dance, not of cruelty, but of balance. And yet, even in this gradual struggle, there was peace. Life did not fight against the earth. It flowed with it. The rains nourished the grasses fed the grazers fed the hunters. When they fell, their bodies returned to the soil, feeding the cycle anew. It was harmony, raw and unspoken. Imagine standing on one of those plains, the air soft and warm, filled with the rustle of tall grass. In the distance, the silhouettes of early elephants, ancestors of the great woolly mammoths, move in quiet procession. Their trunks sway gently, touching the ground, lifting scents from the breeze. The sky glows with a pale orange light as the sun sinks below the horizon. The earth hums softly, as if whispering to itself. In those endless evenings, the world was serene, vast, unhurried, and full of potential. Over time, rivers continued to carve new paths, carrying life in every droplet. The oceans pulsed with currents that shaped climate and migration. Coral reefs expanded like living cities beneath the waves. On the coasts, seabirds soared above the surf, their wings catching the glint of sunlight on water. Each part of the planet, from desert to deep sea, from tundra to forest, found its rhythm again. And in the background of this slow, patient evolution, The Earth's memory held everything. The age of fire and impact had become a story written in stone, a tale of destruction, yes, but also of rebirth. Every layer of sediment was a page, every fossil a word. Together, they told a story that would one day be read by curious eyes, trying to piece together how the world began again. The silence that followed the asteroid's fury had not been the end, it was a pause, a moment for the Earth to breathe, to dream, and to begin a new life. As it always had, found a way, asterisk. As the eons drifted forward, the Earth's transformation deepened. The violence of the asteroid impact had long since faded into quiet memory, and the scars it left behind were softened by forests, rivers, and oceans that had reclaimed their place. The continents drifted on their slow, steady paths, moving only inches each year, yet in those inches lay the shaping of entire worlds. The world was entering what would one day be called the late Neogene period, a time when the stage of life broadened, and the actors changed again. The air had grown cooler now, drier in places, as global temperatures continued to adjust. The once dense tropical forests that blanketed much of the planet began to give way to vast stretches of grassland and savanna. Here, under a pale blue sky, life adapted once again. Great herds of grazing animals, horses, antelope-like creatures, and early elephants wandered through the tall golden grasses. Their movements were unhurried, rhythmic, timeless. Each day was a quiet cycle of feeding, resting, and traveling, following the rains that came and went with the seasons. And in the shade of the remaining forests, other creatures thrived. Small primates with watchful eyes leaped through the canopy, their hands gripping branches with ease. Early apes, ancestors of our own kind, began to explore life beyond the trees. They would climb down to the ground to forage for food, moving cautiously through the undergrowth, aware of the predators that stalked the shadows on the edges of rivers and lakes. The world was full of sound, the chirping of insects, the soft calls of birds, the gentle splash of animals wading through water. Fish shimmered below the surface, their scales glinting like fragments of sunlight. Reeds swayed gently with the wind, whispering against one another like distant voices telling ancient secrets. The Earth was alive again, in full harmony with itself, and far above, the sky had changed to... The atmosphere was clearer now, free from the ash and debris that had once darkened it. The sun shone with a golden warmth, and at night, the stars burned with quiet brilliance. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a trail of silver dust, a reminder of the cosmic vastness that the little blue planet had survived. Volcanoes still breathed, as they always had, slow and steady reminders of the Earth's restless core. But their eruptions now brought nourishment as much as danger. The ash they spread enriched the soil, feeding the forests that grew thick around their slopes. In this constant cycle of creation and renewal, the planet continued to shape itself. In these long stretches of time, entire continents shifted identities. Where once there had been ocean, there was now land. Mountain ranges rose as tectonic plates collided. The Himalayas reached higher into the sky. The Andes lengthened their shadow across South America. Great rivers, born from melting snow, cut deep into the rock, carrying life across continents. Each change came slowly, so slowly that no living thing noticed. But with patience, mountains crumbled, valleys deepened, and the face of Earth evolved into something closer to the world we know today. Imagine standing at the edge of one of these young mountains. The air is crisp, cool, and thin. The wind whispers softly through your hair, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone. Below, a wide valley stretches out, carved by ancient glaciers that have long since melted. Rivers snake through it like ribbons of silver. The world feels vast, timeless, and utterly at peace. It was during these millions of years that climates began to oscillate. Warm periods were followed by cooler ones. Ice crept slowly down from the poles, retreating again when the Earth's orbit shifted and the sun's warmth returned. These were the first murmurs of what would one day become the great ice ages. The changing climate shaped everything. Forests migrated north and south as temperatures rose and fell. Animals followed them, traveling across continents in search of food and warmth. The early ancestors of mammoths began to appear, great, shaggy creatures with curved tusks, adapted for cold environments. Saber-toothed cats prowled the edges of forests, their sleek bodies moving silently through snow and grass. The Earth, though restless, had found a rhythm, a slow, steady pulse that carried life forward through endless cycles of change. Even in the oceans, the world was transforming. Coral reefs flourished in the warm shallows of the tropics, hosting entire ecosystems of color and motion. In deeper waters, whales ruled, descendants of land mammals that had taken to the sea millions of years earlier. They moved through the blue with grace, their songs echoing for miles beneath the surface. Ancient melodies of connection and migration. Tiny plankton filled the upper layers of the water, drifting with the currents, feeding countless creatures. The sea was alive from top to bottom, pulsing with quiet energy. Every drop of water carried life. If you could drift over the earth in those times, you would see a planet of contrasts. Icy poles glinting in white and blue, lush equatorial jungles, thick and humid, buzzing with insects, rolling grasslands shimmering under golden light, mountains capped with snow, rivers twisting like veins through the body of the world. It was a planet reborn from ruin, resilient, self-healing, an endlessly creative. In the warmth of the lowlands, early primates watched the world with curious eyes. They lived in small groups, communicating with calls and gestures, learning from one another. They used stones to crack open nuts or dig for roots. It was the faintest spark of ingenuity, a whisper of what would one day become thought, language, and culture, but that was still far in the future. For now, they lived simply attuned to the rhythm of the earth. Their lives, like all others, were bound to the seasons and the sun. As the epochs unfolded, the planet's climate continued to cool. The world edged closer to the deep freezes that would come and go over the next millions of years. Ice advanced again, covering much of the northern hemisphere. Entire ecosystems migrated southward. The wind carried snow across vast plains, shaping the landscape into smooth white silence. And yet, even in this cold, life endured. In the tundra, moss and lichen grew beneath the snow. Great herds of mammoths and reindeer roamed the frozen steppes. Wolves followed in their tracks, moving like shadows. The earth's heartbeat had slowed, but it had not stopped. The sky above these icy lands was pale and soft, painted with the faint glow of the aurora. Curtains of green and purple light rippled across the horizon, a reminder that even in the planet's quietest hours, there was still beauty. The air was cold enough to sting the skin, but clear enough to see for miles. In the distance, mountains stood like ancient guardians, watching over the frozen valleys. Rivers, once rushing with meltwater, now slept beneath sheets of ice. Time moved so slowly that you could almost feel it. Each flake of snow, each shift in the wind, part of the great turning of the world. Eventually, the ice would retreat again, as it always did. The cycle of cooling and warming would repeat, carving the Earth's story into stone and memory. Forests would return to the places they had once fled. Animals would reclaim their old territories. The world would breathe out, exhaling life once more. And through all of it, the planet endured in silence, patient, steady, alive. When the great glaciers melted, they left behind vast lakes and valleys. Rivers changed course, finding new paths to the sea. Fertile plains emerged where ice had once crushed everything. Seeds took root, and grass spread across the new land. The rhythm of life resumed unbroken. The story of Earth after the asteroid was not one of destruction, but of resilience. From the ashes of catastrophe, life had grown again, delicate at first, then strong, then wondrously diverse. The silence that followed the impact had become a symphony of existence, unfolding slowly under the watchful sky. If you were to close your eyes and imagine the world, then the rustle of grass, the call of a distant bird, the whisper of wind through trees, you would feel it. That quiet, steady pulse, the heartbeat of a planet that had survived everything. The asteroid had brought an ending, yes, but it had also brought a beginning. And that beginning, gentle and eternal, would one day lead to us. The Earth turned once more, slowly, steadily, as it always had. Seasons shifted, centuries drifted by like soft waves, and life continued its quiet song. The great glaciers still lay heavy upon the northern lands, thick and pale beneath the dim sun. From space, the planet glowed with ribbons of white, stretching down from the poles like gentle fingers of frost. Yet even beneath the cold, life persisted. The tundra, frozen and silent, hid roots and seeds waiting for warmth. When the brief summers came, they awakened, tiny bursts of color across endless plains, yellow wildflowers, patches of moss, delicate blossoms trembling in the wind. The air filled with the hum of insects, and herds of mammoths wandered across the land, their shaggy coats glistening with frost. They moved in small groups, mothers and young, following ancient migration paths that stretched for hundreds of miles. Wolves shadowed them from afar, their paws silent on snow, their breaths steaming in the morning light. The world was balanced in quiet struggle, predator and prey, life and death, all part of the rhythm that guided the earth through its endless cycle. When night fell, the sky came alive. Curtains of light shimmered above the ice, pale green and violet ribbons dancing across the heavens. The aurora was a slow, silent song, the breath of the sun meeting the cold air of the poles. Beneath it, the frozen seas whispered and cracked, the ice shifting gently as tides rose and fell. Deep in the south, where the air was warmer and forests still covered the land, other creatures flourished. Great cats prowled the jungles, their golden eyes glinting between shadows. Monkeys swung from branch to branch, calling softly through the trees. Birds of brilliant color filled the air with their songs. The world was diverse, balanced between heat and cold, between creation and quiet decay. And somewhere, in the cradle of warmth, something new began to stir. In the heart of Africa, a place of golden grasslands, wide rivers, and scattered trees, early humans began to take shape. They were still small, still simple, yet something inside them was different. Their eyes reflected thought, curiosity, and an understanding that went beyond instinct. They stood on two legs now, their hands free to grasp, to shape, to explore. They looked across the plains and wondered what lay beyond the horizon. They watched firelight flicker from lightning strikes and learned its warmth. For millions of years, they would remain wanderers, quiet observers of a world in constant motion. They followed herds across vast landscapes, built small shelters from branches and leaves, and spoke in sounds that began to form meaning. The earth had given rise to something. Extraordinary beings who could not only survive but imagine. The Ice Age pressed on, molding continents and creatures alike. Enormous sheets of ice advanced and retreated in a slow rhythm, sculpting the land beneath. Mountains were ground smooth, valleys carved deep, and new rivers formed from the meltwater that trickled south. And as the ice retreated, the sea levels rose, flooding the coasts and creating new islands. The shape of the world was changing once again. Early humans watched these transformations, moving with them. They gathered along riverbanks, where fish swam in abundance. They learned to shape stones into tools, to cut, to scrape, to build. The rhythm of their lives was slow, but each generation carried a spark, a little more knowledge, a little more understanding. When night fell, they gazed at the stars. Those same stars that had once looked down upon dinosaurs and drifting meteors, now shone upon small fires flickering in the dark. Imagine sitting by one of those fires. The air is cool, the grass whispers in the breeze, and sparks rise into the night like tiny souls. Around you, a small band of early humans huddles together, their faces glowing orange in the light. They speak softly, their language still forming, their thoughts heavy with wonder. Above, the Milky Way stretches wide and endless. The sound of insects hums in the background, a lullaby of the earth. These early humans didn't know it, but they were watching the dawn of something vast, a future that would one day reshape the entire planet. But for now, they lived simply. They hunted, gathered, and moved with the seasons. Each sunrise was a gift, each night a time for rest. The Earth's climate continued to shift. The glaciers melted further, retreating northward. Grasslands expanded, forests crept back into the lands they had lost, rivers swelled, carrying nutrients across fertile plains, and with this new abundance came the rise of more complex life. Mammoths gave way to elephants. The great saber-toothed cats disappeared, replaced by smaller predators. The balance shifted again, as it always had. In the oceans, whales continued their eternal migrations, their songs carrying for miles beneath the surface. Coral reefs glowed with life. Schools of fish shimmered like liquid silver. The sea had found its calm. On land, the rhythm of seasons settled into patterns. Spring rains brought growth. Summer heat ripened the grasses. Autumn painted the trees in gold. Winter whispered across the land with quiet breath. It was a cycle both fragile and eternal, and within it, humankind began to awaken. Somewhere near the Great Rift Valley, a small group learned to control fire, not by chance, but by choice. They gathered dry grass, small sticks, and flint. They sparked light from stone, feeding the flames with patience. When it caught, they watched it dance and crackle, warm against the cool air. This was no longer mere survival. It was creation. With fire came protection, comfort, and community. It lit their nights, warmed their food, and kept the wild at bay. It became the heart of every gathering, a symbol of safety, of thought, of progress. And so, as the ice ages slowly waned, humans began to spread. They followed the receding glaciers into new lands, across open plains, through mountain passes, along river valleys. Their footprints marked every continent, every shore. They crossed into Asia, into Europe, into the far reaches of the world. Each new land brought new challenges, colder air, different beasts, unfamiliar plants. But humanity adapted. Their shelters grew stronger, their tools sharper, their knowledge deeper. Still, they were quiet travelers. The world was vast, and they were few. They lived close to the earth, in harmony with its moods. When the wind howled, they listened. When the rains came, they danced. It was an existence shaped by patience, by observation, by awe. As the millennia unfolded, the world began to look more like the one we know. The glaciers melted further, raising oceans and shaping coastlines. Forests thickened, deserts spread, and the familiar shapes of continents became clear. In the warmth of the post-glacial age, life flourished. Herds of bison, horses, and aurochs roamed the plains. Birds filled the skies in dazzling rivers sparkled with life, reflecting the blue of an open sky, and humans began to paint, deep in caves. They traced the shapes of animals on stone walls, horses, mammoths, and deer, drawn with charcoal and ochre. Their hands pressed against the rock, leaving imprints that still remain today. It was art, an echo of thought, made visible. They didn't just live in the world anymore. They began to dream about it. The ice ages drew to a close. The earth warmed once more, breathing deeply after its long cold sleep. Forests spread north, reclaiming the tundra. The great herds moved with them, followed by the humans who hunted and learned from their paths. In these final centuries of the Pleistocene, the planet found a new balance. The cycles of ice and melt slowed, settling into the gentle climate that would allow civilization to bloom. The earth, once a scarred and shattered rock in the shadow of an asteroid, had become a cradle for thought, art, and spirit. The stars above had watched it all, from fire and ash to frost and rebirth. Now, they watched as small human fires flickered across the land, spreading light across the darkness. It was a quiet triumph, not of power, but of persistence. And as the night deepened, as the winds softened, the world seemed to hum with peace. Oceans whispered against their shores, trees swayed in the breeze, the sky glowed faintly with starlight, infinite and calm. The story of Earth was still being written, not in haste, but in slow, beautiful patience. The impact that had once ended a world had, in time, given rise to this, to a planet reborn, alive, and dreaming. The cycle continued. The heartbeat of the Earth, steady and eternal, carried life forward once more. The Earth was warmer now. The long shadows of the glaciers had faded, leaving behind fertile valleys and wide green plains. Rivers, swollen from the melting ice, meandered across the continents, carving their stories into the land. The world was waking, quietly and beautifully, as if stretching after a long and dream-filled sleep. And with this awakening came the dawn of a new age, the age of humankind's quiet transformation. The people of this world were still simple wanderers, but something within them was stirring. They began to stay longer in certain places by rivers, near lakes, in valleys where the soil was rich and the seasons gentle. They learned to watch the rhythm of the land, to understand when rains would come, when the animals would migrate, when the plants would bear fruit. In this gentle observation, they discovered something extraordinary. Seeds, tiny, almost invisible to the eye, yet holding within them the promise of an entire world. When planted in the soil and nourished by water and sunlight, they grew slowly, patiently into food that could sustain life. It was the birth of agriculture, and though it began in quiet corners on the banks of the Nile, in the valleys of Mesopotamia, among the green hills of China, its ripples would change the face of the earth forever. For the first time, people did not have to wander endlessly in search of food. They could stay, build, grow. Small villages began to appear, clusters of huts made from reeds and clay, encircled by fields of barley and wheat that swayed in the gentle wind. Smoke rose from cooking fires at dusk. Children laughed as they ran along the riverbanks. Dogs lay curled beside the doorways, their eyes half closed in the warmth of the fading sun. It was a simple life, but one of balance and rhythm. morning light over the fields, the hum of insects, the distant call of birds, the murmur of water moving over stones. Each day was guided by the land, planting, tending, harvesting, resting. The cycle of life and labor was slow and dependable, mirroring the calm heartbeat of the earth itself. And in this stillness, something else began to take root. Thought, reflection, wonder. Humans began to ask questions about the sun that rose each morning, about the stars that glowed each night. They looked to the heavens and saw patterns, the steady movement of constellations, the return of seasons. They began to mark time, to count days and moons, to understand the gentle mathematics of existence. With this understanding came stories. They spoke of gods who brought the rains, of spirits who lived in the rivers, of ancestors who watched over them from the stars. These stories gave comfort, meaning, and a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves. Around evening fires, voices murmured softly, weaving tales that drifted up into the night like smoke. The earth listened. Villages grew into towns. Paths became roads. People traded with one another. Grains, tools, pottery, ideas. Knowledge spread slowly, like water seeping through soil. In Mesopotamia, they built canals to guide the rivers, shaping water with precision. In the Nile Valley, farmers watched the annual floods bring life to their crops. In the Indus Plains, communities planned their streets with care and order. The world was no longer wild and wandering. It was being gently shaped by human hands. And yet, the essence of earth remained: the scent of rain on dry ground, the distant rumble of thunder, the sighing of the wind through tall grass. Life was peaceful, cyclical, and deeply connected to nature's quiet moods. When night came, the stars returned to their watch. The same constellations that had guided the hunters now guided the farmers. The same moon that had hung above glaciers now reflected in the calm waters of irrigation canals. It was as if the universe itself had softened, allowing this small blue planet a moment of rest and reflection. Then these early communities, humans began to create, not just out of necessity, but out of beauty. They shaped clay into bowls and jars, painting patterns inspired by rivers and mountains. They carved figures of stone, of mothers, animals, and unseen spirits, offering them as symbols of gratitude to the world that sustained them. Art had become a language of peace, and music followed. Simple flutes made from reeds, drums stretched with animal hide, rhythms that echoed footsteps, heartbeats, rainfall, around evening fires. Songs rose into the air, mingling with the scent of smoke and earth. They were songs of life, of planting, of harvest, of love, of loss, sung slowly and softly beneath the starlight. This was the quiet hum of civilization's beginning, not grand or hurried, but patient and alive. As centuries drifted by, knowledge deepened. People learned to build with stone, to write upon clay, to measure the passage of time. Great rivers became the lifelines of early worlds: the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Yangtze. Along their banks, humanity learned to thrive. Each sunrise was a continuation of an endless rhythm, the world turning, the soil breathing, the sky watching. And yet, beneath this calm, the earth was still restless. Volcanoes still smoldered beneath mountains. The seas still rose and fell with the pull of the moon. The wind still sculpted sand dunes across deserts. The earth remained alive, not tamed, merely understood a little better. There were moments of change. Floods that washed away villages, droughts that tested survival, storms that reminded humans of their fragility. But even in loss, they learned resilience. They rebuilt, they waited for the rain to return. Life was no longer a struggle against nature. It was a partnership. The people watched the horizon for signs, the color of the clouds, the songs of birds, the whisper of the wind through reeds. They became readers of the world, translators of its moods, and through this connection came peace, a sense of belonging not above nature, but within it. Generations passed. Children grew and learned from their elders. Fields expanded. Tools became sharper, stronger, more precise. Grain storage allowed for times of plenty and times of scarcity. Communities began to dream beyond survival. They built temples, not for conquest, but for gratitude. Tall, simple structures of stone and mud, where offerings of grain, milk, and flowers were placed before carved figures. In the still air of these places, people prayed not for power, but for balance, for rain, for health, for the return of the sun. And so, Humanity entered its first golden age of calm. The earth had healed from the fire and ruin of its past. Life had returned in quiet abundance. The scars of the asteroid, though still buried deep beneath rock and ocean, had been softened by time and by the steady persistence of life. At dawn, the sun rose over gentle hills. Mist drifted across rivers. The world glowed in golden green. Farmers stepped into their fields, their shadows long against the morning light. Children laughed. The smell of fresh bread carried from small homes. The world was alive, peaceful, breathing, timeless. From the ashes of extinction had come not just survival, but harmony. And if one stood there, in that early world, beside a river, listening to the quiet rhythm of oars dipping into the water, birds calling from trees, and the far hum of wind over plains, one could feel the earth's heartbeat, slow, steady, eternal. It was the sound of life, beginning again, and somewhere deep within the soil, older layers still held memory, the bones of dinosaurs, the impressions of ancient leaves, the echoes of worlds long gone. Yet above them, new life bloomed, new dreams unfurled. Time had done what it always does. It had healed, renewed, and reminded the universe that even after ending, there is always something more. The story of Earth, from fire to frost to flowering life, had entered a new chapter, one written not in meteors or extinction, but in patience, in hope, and in quiet understanding. Asterisk. The world had grown gentle. The scars of chaos were covered by fields and forests, and the hum of life spread across the continents like the slow breathing of the earth itself. Humanity, once a scattered species of wanderers, now moved with quiet purpose, building lives rooted in the rhythm of the land. But as generations passed, something inside them began to change again, not in the body, but in the mind. The world they had learned to understand began to whisper new mysteries. Rivers spoke of faraway lands. The stars hinted at deeper patterns, and in the calm of evening fires, the first dreams of greatness began to take form. It began where two rivers met, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Between them lay a plain of dark, fertile earth that drank greedily from the floods each spring. Here, people gathered, built, and stayed. They called this place the land between rivers. Later, the world would call it Sumer. The days there were warm and bright, filled with the hum of insects and the steady sound of water moving through the canals they had carved. Mud brick homes rose along the riverbanks, small at first, but soon joined by others, until the settlements became towns, and the towns became cities. Smoke drifted gently above rooftops at dusk. Oxen pulled wooden plows through soft soil. Fishermen cast their nets into slow-moving water, and above it all, the wide Mesopotamian sky glowed golden in the fading light. In the quiet of these early cities, the people began to build something new, not just homes or farms, but meaning. They raised temples that reached upward, flat-topped and vast, like mountains made by human hands. These were the ziggurats, stepped towers of sun-baked clay. At their summits, priests watched the stars and measured the heavens, believing that through this watching, they could understand the language of the gods. The people believed that the world was full of divine breath, in the rivers that flooded and receded, in the wind that carried storms, in the grain that rose from the soil. And so they built these towers as bridges between earth and sky, hoping that in their prayers and offerings, the balance of nature would remain kind. At dawn, the city would awaken slowly. Merchants unrolled woven mats to display their goods, copper, barley, oil, and wool. Potters arranged their wares in the sunlight. Children ran through the narrow alleys, their laughter echoing against the clay walls. And from the ziggurat steps, the sound of low chanting drifted across the city, steady, rhythmic, ancient. And then, somewhere within this early civilization, came one of the most remarkable creations of all, the first written words. At first, they were simple marks pressed into soft clay with the edge of a reed, symbols that recorded the exchange of grain, the offering of goods, the counting of sheep. But slowly, those marks became more than numbers. They became stories, songs, names, the first attempt to preserve memory beyond the fragile limits of the human voice. The clay tablets of carried the heartbeat of a new age, one where thought could outlive its thinker. And with writing came time. The people began to record not just what they had done, but when they marked seasons, reigns of kings, floods of rivers. The endless flow of life gained shape and order. The world had entered its first conversation with itself. Far to the west, another river flowed, long, winding, eternal. It was called the Nile. Each year, it would rise and fall with precision, flooding the surrounding land with dark, rich silt. The people who lived along its banks called it a gift, for it fed their crops, their animals, and their lives. And so, just as Sumer had risen from the twin rivers of the east, Egypt rose from this single river of the west. At dawn, mist drifted above the Nile's surface, glowing pink in the soft light. Fishermen's boats cut through the still water. The air carried the scent of wet reeds and fresh earth. Along the banks, villagers stirred, farmers preparing their fields, potters shaping clay, weavers threading linen in the shade of palm trees. The Nile was everything: a road, a wellspring, a god. Its steady rhythm was the heartbeat of Egypt itself, and as the centuries turned, its people began to build in stone. First small temples, then vast structures that reached toward the horizon, monuments to eternity. Carved with the stories of kings and gods, the pyramids rose slowly, like mountains of light. Workers sang as they pulled heavy stones across the sand, their voices low and steady, blending with the hum of wind and desert air. Days melted into years, years into generations. Each block lifted, each carving etched, was an act of faith, a belief that through effort, one might touch the divine. Inside the temples, cool and shadowed, priests burned incense that curled like silver threads toward the ceiling. They spoke the names of gods Ra, the sun; Osiris, the eternal one; Isis, the mother of all life. The scent of myrrh filled the air. Light filtered through narrow slits in the walls, dancing on the painted surfaces of stone. Time here was not measured in days or hours, but in cycles of life, death, and rebirth. The sun rose each morning, sailed across the sky, and sank into the underworld, only to rise again. The people of the Nile saw in this rhythm a mirror of their own journey. They built for forever, believing that the soul, like the sun, would one day return. And in their stillness, their careful shaping of stone and sand, they left behind something that even time itself could not easily erase. Beyond Egypt and Sumer, across wide plains and high mountains, other civilizations began to stir. In the Indus Valley, cities of baked brick rose in geometric precision, streets straight, drains covered, houses cooled by the evening breeze. In China, along the Yellow River, farmers tended millet fields, and ancestors were honored with offerings of food and wine. The earth had become a web of human creation, quiet, steady, glowing faintly with the fires of early cities. The world, once ruled by survival and storm, was now guided by thought. Humanity had learned not only to live, but to imagine. At night, from the rooftops of these ancient towns, the stars shone as they always had, the same stars that had watched over the dinosaurs, the same that had witnessed the first humans crossing open plains. But now, they were being read, mapped, recorded. The constellations became stories. The stories became calendars, and calendars became civilizations. Time was no longer a mystery. It was a pattern to be traced, a rhythm to be followed. And through it all, the earth remained unchanged in its quiet beauty. The rivers flowed, the winds whispered, the rain fell, the seasons turned. Humanity had built walls and temples and towers, but beyond their reach, the wild still stretched, deserts glowing in the sun, forests humming with life, mountains sleeping beneath snow. Even in the rise of civilization, nature remained the silent architect. The people of this age did not yet know how vast the world was, how small their empires would seem in the span of eternity, but they built as if the world would last forever, as if their names, carved into stone, could outlast the tides of time. Perhaps, in some quiet way, they were right, for the marks they left in clay, in stone, in the language of the stars still whispered their stories thousands of years later. The hum of the potter's wheel, the scratch of a reed on clay, the echo of footsteps within a temple. Each sound, each act, was part of a much greater music, the steady song of civilization rising from the memory of earth. And though the world would change, again kingdoms rising and falling, rivers shifting course, sands covering once great cities, the calm rhythm of creation had begun, and it would never fully fade. If one stood by the riverbank in ancient Sumer, or at dawn along the Nile, or in the quiet lanes of the Indus Valley, one might feel it, that same pulse of life, that same soft whisper, the earth, remembering itself. From silence, it had made voices. From chaos, order. From stone and soil, dreams. And beneath it all, deep within the heart of the planet, the old fires still glowed faintly, warm and alive. the memory of all that had been still hummed within the earth's molten core, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The story of life was far from over. It had only just begun to speak. Asterisk. The rivers had given birth to the first cities, and the cities now gave birth to the first connections between them. Across plains and deserts, paths began to form, not yet the great roads of later ages, but soft trails in the sand, shaped by the footsteps of traders and the slow turning of cartwheels. Caravans moved like lines of patience, stretching from horizon to horizon. Donkeys carried sacks of grain, baskets of copper, bundles of cloth. Along the way, they met others, strangers who spoke different tongues but carried the same glimmer of purpose in their eyes. Barter became conversation, and conversation became understanding. The world was no longer a scatter of isolated valleys. It was beginning to weave itself together. In Sumer, the kings ruled from cities whose names still echo faintly through time. Uruk, Lagat. Their palaces rose beside the temples, walls carved with images of kings and lions, gods and rivers. They measured their fields, counted their stores, recorded their wars and harvests on tablets that hardened in the sun. Each word was a promise that memory would endure. They learned to shape bronze, a blend of copper and tin, glowing gold in the firelight. With it came new strength. Tools cut deeper, plows bit harder into the earth, spears and blades shone brighter in the sun. Bronze was more than metal. It was power across the lands. Its light spread to Egypt, to the highlands of Anatolia, to the valleys of the Indus and beyond. In Egypt, the old kingdoms grew rich with the gifts of the Nile. The pyramids had already risen, their pointed crowns catching the morning light. Now, pharaohs built vast temples, their columns carved with stories of gods and the eternal voyage of the sun. Priests watched the stars from their rooftops, measuring time in cycles of shadow and light. Scribes dipped reeds into ink and drew upon papyrus, capturing prayers, laws, and dreams in a flowing script. The Nile itself seemed to hum with life, the soft sound of oars, the laughter of workers on its banks, the cry of ibis and heron drifting across the water. At night, the desert air cooled, and the stars unfolded like a vast, silent ocean above. The people of the Nile had no need to hurry. Eternity was already theirs. Far to the east, in the lands between the great rivers of the Indus and Sarasvati, cities flourished quietly. Their streets were straight and clean, their drains covered, their wells deep. In Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, life followed a measured rhythm. The people built with care, baked their bricks in the sun, stored grain in orderly rows. They left no great statues or proclamations of kings, only the calm geometry of their cities, and seals carved with mysterious signs. Their language, still unreadable, lies silent, but the balance in their design speaks clearly of peace, order, and thought. And beyond these river valleys, others watched and learned. In the dry lands of Anatolia, in the mountains of Iran, in the plains of Central Asia, new peoples began to move, herders with flocks, travelers with wagons, families chasing the green edge of spring. They carried stories in their memory, fire in their hearts, and the seeds of languages that would one day fill half the world. The wind carried their songs across the grasslands, soft and haunting echoes of home, of sky, of endless distance. In these centuries, trade became the lifeblood of the world. The weight of copper, the shimmer of lapis lazuli, the scent of cedarwood, all moved through invisible veins of exchange. The deserts that once divided, now connected. The sea, once feared, became a pathway. Sails caught the wind along the Persian Gulf. Small boats crossed from Egypt to Crete, from Crete to the islands of the Aegean and beyond. The Mediterranean became a quiet cradle of journeys, each wave carrying whispers of new ideas, new gods, new ways of life. And on the island of Crete itself, something beautiful began to grow, the Minoan civilization. Its palaces were wide and airy, painted with colors that still breathe after thousands of years, reds and blues, the white of sea foam, the gold of sunlight. Frescoes showed dolphins leaping through waves, women in flowing skirts, bulls charging through courtyards. The people of Crete lived close to the sea, and their art seemed to dance with its rhythm, free, flowing, filled with joy. Their cities had no great walls. Perhaps they felt protected by the sea itself, or by the simple grace of their harmony. Theirs was a world of movement, color, and song, while on the mainland, across the water, other peoples began to rise, more stern, more proud. their hands on the sword and the plow. They would one day become known as the Mycenaeans, the early Greeks. But for now, they were still learning the ways of the wider world, building stone halls and listening to the whispers carried by traders from the east. In these ages, gods traveled as easily as goods. The sun of Egypt found echoes in the fire altars of Iran. The flood myths of Mesopotamia reached the mountains of Greece. The sky, once a silent dome, became a shared mirror of belief. Everywhere, people sought to understand their place in the grand design, to know why the rain came, why the stars moved, why death waited so patiently. From these questions, myth was born. In Sumer, they told of Gilgamesh, the king who sought immortality and found only the truth of being human. In Egypt, they spoke of Osiris, torn apart and reborn, showing that even in death there was life. In Crete, the bull was sacred, a symbol of strength and renewal. Each story, in its own way, was a mirror held up to the soul of its people. Time flowed on, slow and steady. Empires grew and crumbled, kings rose and fell, yet the world itself remained calm, unhurried. The rivers still flooded, the sun still rose, and through it all, humanity learned to build, to trade, to write, to dream. Bronze gave shape to tools and weapons, but it also shaped thought. The mind, like the metal, was being forged, refined by fire and pressure, into something lasting. The world was no longer a wilderness of separate places. It was a living network of exchange, ideas flowing like water. From Mesopotamia to the Nile, from the Indus to the Aegean, human voices blended into one soft chorus, the first faint hum of global civilization. If one could stand above the earth, then, and watch from the quiet of the upper air, one would see lights, not of fire or electricity, but of life. Tiny flickers scattered across the continents, pulsing faintly as night fell. Each flicker was a hearth, a village, a family. Each one was a spark of the same dream, to endure. And beneath the stars, those sparks multiplied. Cities glowed faintly along the riverbanks. Smoke rose in lazy columns into the cool night sky. In the stillness of that world, you could almost hear it, the heartbeat of the earth, steady and ancient, beating beneath the feet of a young civilization. The world was growing quieter, wiser, more aware. Humanity had not yet reached the age of iron, nor the full blaze of empire, but the pattern had begun, the slow weaving of destiny through soil, sky, and spirit. And in that long, peaceful dawn, as the fires of bronze shimmered and cooled, the earth waited patiently for what would come next, the rise of kings who would dream of eternity, the wars that would shake mountains, the songs that would cross oceans. But for now, in the calm before those storms, the world rested, the rivers whispered, the stars watched, and the human heart, small and fragile, yet endlessly curious, looked outward into the dark, into the future, and began to imagine what might lie beyond the horizon. It was a quiet age, but beneath its silence, the foundations of everything yet to come were being laid. The first empires were stirring, the first legends were taking shape, the breath of history was deepening. And the earth, timeless and patient, continued its slow, endless turning beneath the stars. Asterisk. The world had learned to build, to trade, and to dream, and now it began to learn to rule. As the Bronze Age matured, the scattered lights of civilization gathered into constellations of power. Cities joined under banners, kings began to call themselves gods. The rivers that once carried grain now carried the weight of empire. In Egypt, the pharaohs of the new kingdom rose from the long quiet after the age of pyramids. Their monuments stretched along the Nile like notes in an eternal song. Temples gleamed in the morning sun. Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, each stone heavy with the prayers of countless hands. The air was thick with the scent of incense and lotus, and the sound of flutes drifted between pillars carved with stories of conquest and divine harmony. The pharaohs ruled not only as kings, but as bridges between heaven and earth. Their word was order, their silence, fate. Beneath them, artisans painted tomb walls with gentle precision. Golden suns, blue rivers, delicate feathers of the goddess, Mat, who balanced the hearts of men against truth itself. Life along the Nile flowed in its endless rhythm. Flood, planting, harvest, flood again. Farmers rose with the dawn, their shadows long in the mist, their feet sinking into the fertile black soil. Children laughed as they followed oxen across the fields, and each evening, when the sky turned to liquid gold, the people looked west, to the land of the dead, and whispered, "Thanks for another day beneath the sun." Beyond Egypt, To the east, the old cities of Mesopotamia breathed once more. Babylon rose again, proud and radiant, its walls tall and its gardens legendary. The streets glowed with the light of oil lamps. Merchants moved between stalls of spices, ivory, and lapis, and in the distance, the ziggurat towered like a mountain of brick, its steps leading upward to the stars. The Babylonians had mapped those stars with patient wonder. They had watched the heavens for centuries, charting the slow dance of Venus, the turning of Jupiter, the pattern of eclipses. For them, the sky was not mystery, but message, a celestial record written in the language of light. Kings like Hammurabi had long ago set their codes in stone, laws carved with care, balancing justice and order. And though centuries had passed, that idea still lingered, that society itself could be shaped not only by strength, but by wisdom. But to the north, where the rivers ran narrow and the hills rose high, a harder people were awakening, the Assyrians. Their cities were carved from stone and guarded by lions with human faces. Their kings were relentless, their armies disciplined and fierce. From Nineveh and Ashur, they stretched their reach across the known world. Yet even in their might, there was art. The walls of their palaces shimmered with scenes of hunts and harvests, of victories and feasts. The hands that carved these stones were steady, patient, not the hands of conquerors, but of craftsmen. Even power, it seemed, longed for beauty. And while kingdoms rose and fell, a quiet current of progress continued beneath them all. New metals were born from fire. Iron, dark, strong, unyielding, began to replace bronze. The world's age was turning. Iron spread, first through small workshops, then through armies, then through empires, a tool harder than any before. It shaped forests, built walls, and drew lines of power across the land. But it also shaped a new kind of humanity, one that believed more firmly in its control over the world. The tools of survival had become instruments of destiny. Across mountains and deserts, new voices joined the world's chorus. In the highlands of Anatolia, the Hittites forged their own empire, blending old Sumerian gods with their own skyward deities. They built roads of stone, held councils, and wrote treaties on clay, the first written agreements between nations. Further east, in the valleys of Persia, quiet tribes began to gather under a single vision, a belief in unity, in truth, in light. In time, their kings would build an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Indus, a realm of astonishing size and grace. But before that moment came, the lands of the east shimmered with smaller lights, Elam, Media, and countless others, each dreaming, each building, each leaving behind faint echoes of human hands. In these centuries, the earth seemed to breathe more slowly. Empires grew and faded, yet the balance of the world remained calm. The sun rose over pyramids and ziggurats alike. Farmers in Egypt looked up at the same dawn as traders in Mesopotamia, as shepherds in the hills of Anatolia, as fishermen on the shores of the Aegean. The world, for the first time, was aware of itself. Trade moved in loops, gold from Nubia, tin from the mountains, cedar from Lebanon, grain from the delta. Along these routes, people shared more than goods. They shared ideas, stories, songs, and symbols. It was the age when writing became thought made visible. In Sumer and Babylon, cuneiform tablets recorded everything from harvests to hymns. In Egypt, the elegant brushstrokes of hieroglyphs adorned tombs and papyrus alike. In the Indus, the script remained silent, mysterious as a dream. And somewhere on the islands of the Aegean, a new alphabet was forming, one simple enough to travel, to change, to be shared. The letters we now use, in ways unbroken through millennia, trace their ancestry to this moment, two hands that sought to capture sound, and in doing so, preserved the voice of humanity forever. But as knowledge spread, so too did ambition. Kings no longer sought to rule a city or a valley. They sought the world. In the golden sands of Egypt, pharaohs like Thutmose and Ramses marched north, their chariots gleaming beneath the sun. Their banners met those of the Hittites at Kadesh, two worlds colliding in thunder and dust. The battle raged, and yet from it came something new: diplomacy. For the first time, peace was written not just in words, but in understanding. The great powers agreed to coexist, their signatures pressed into clay, their seals bound by trust. Elsewhere, in the east, other alliances formed. Babylon, Assyria, Elam kingdoms, intertwined by rivalry and respect. The world was becoming a living organism, its veins filled with trade, its pulse set by the rhythm of conquest and exchange. And beneath it all, the quiet wisdom of ordinary people endured. The potter turning clay by lamplight, the scribe tracing lines into wet tablets, the mother humming to her child as the desert wind brushed softly against the walls of her home. These were the true heartbeats of civilization, steady, unnoticed, eternal. As the centuries drifted onward, the Bronze Age began to fade like a long sunset. Storms swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Cities burned and vanished. Empires fell into silence. But from that darkness, new stars began to rise, younger, brighter, eager to define a new age. The Greeks, who would one day tell stories of gods and heroes. The Persians, who would unite lands from Egypt to India under a vision of order and truth. And far beyond, in China's river valleys, new dynasties began to shape their own world of jade and silk. The age of empires had begun. But in this moment, this long, luminous twilight between ages, the earth was still. It was a silence filled with memory, a breath before history's next awakening. The old gods still watched from their temples. The rivers still carried whispers of forgotten kings. The stars still shone with patient light. And humanity, standing between earth and sky, was learning not only to survive, but to shape its destiny. The Bronze Age had been the foundation, a slow, shimmering dawn. Now, in the cool air of night, the first light of a new world began to rise. The world exhaled, calm, endless, eternal, and prepared for the birth of the Iron Age, and with it, the first chapters of recorded history as we know it. Asterisk. The Iron Age began quietly, almost unnoticed. There was no grand sound of beginning, no trumpet in the hills. It arrived like the faint blush of dawn after a long night. The world had changed, and yet, in its slow turning, it had simply continued. Where once bronze had shone gold beneath the sun, now the darker gleam of iron ruled the earth. From hidden forges in distant mountains, sparks leapt like stars, and men learned to shape metal that could bend and endure. Tools grew stronger, plows cut deeper into the soil, and weapons, though their edges were seldom spoken of aloud, changed the balance of power. But beyond the clang of hammers and the smoke of foundries, the world itself was ripening. Civilization had reached a kind of rhythm, a deep and steady heartbeat that carried it from river to river, coast to coast. In the heart of Persia, the dream of unity took shape beneath an open sky. From humble beginnings among highland tribes, the empire of Cyrus the Great unfurled like a vast tapestry, threads of gold and sand woven across continents. His armies were swift, but his rule was gentle. Cities that had known only conquest found, at last, a measure of peace. The Persians built roads that stretched like veins across their world, the Royal Road, carrying messengers, merchants, and travelers from Susa to Sardis. Along its path, inns and way stations offered water and shelter, while the flame of Zoroastrian fire temples flickered in the night. Symbols of truth and order, in their capital of Persepolis, columns rose like petrified trees, their carvings depicting processions of people from distant lands, Ethiopians, Medes, Lydians, Babylonians, all bringing gifts, all part of something larger. It was, for a moment, as though humanity had learned to see itself as one. Yet far across the Aegean Sea, another kind of awakening was taking place. The islands and peninsulas of Greece were alive with light, not the light of empire, but of mind there. Between mountains and olive groves, people gathered not in temples of gold, but in open courtyards, to speak, to ask, to wonder. What is justice? What is truth? What is the soul? Under the shade of fig trees, the philosophers began to shape questions that would echo through every age that followed. Socrates walked the streets of Athens barefoot, his eyes bright with curiosity. Plato dreamed of a perfect city, built not from stone, but from ideas. Aristotle, his student, mapped the patterns of nature, believing that even the stars obeyed reason. The Greeks loved thought the way others loved music. To them, the universe was not chaos but harmony, a grand and perfect order, waiting to be understood. Their temples gleamed with white marble, their theaters echoed with poetry and laughter. Yet, beneath all their splendor, there was still the same pulse of simplicity. Fishermen mending nets by the sea, women weaving cloth by lamplight, the scent of bread rising from village ovens. Life was hard, yes, but it was also luminous. Every stone and breeze seemed to carry a trace of meaning. And yet, beyond Greece's coasts, other powers stirred. To the west, a small settlement on 7 hills was growing stronger. Rome, not yet an empire, but already filled with ambition. Its streets were lined with wooden houses and humble shrines. The Tiber flowed gently past fields of grain, and shepherds guided flocks beneath a warm sun. The Romans were not dreamers like the Greeks, nor builders of harmony like the Persians. They were something else, patient, practical, tireless. Their strength lay not in ideas, but in endurance. As these civilizations rose, the world became more connected than ever before. The Mediterranean, that bright blue mirror between continents, was now a highway of sails and stories. Ships glided from port to port, carrying olive oil, glass, spices, and silks sought in distant China. The Zhou dynasty was giving way to new powers, and the teachings of Confucius and Laozi were shaping a different path, one of balance, respect, and quiet understanding. In India, the hymns of the Vedas whispered across centuries, while the first teachings of the Buddha spread along dusty roads, offering compassion in a world of struggle. It was as if, all at once, humanity was awakening, not through conquest, but through consciousness. In every corner of the earth, people began to look inward, to ask not just how to live, but why. The great empires traded not only goods, but philosophies. Ideas traveled along the same paths as gold and grain, carried in the minds of travelers, scribes, and pilgrims. From Greece to Persia, from Egypt to India, knowledge became the most precious cargo of all. Yet, as always, the world remained fragile. The Iron Age was not peaceful, though we speak of it now in hushed tones. Its people lived amid constant change. Empires grew, then fractured. Kingdoms flourished, then fell into dust. And through it all, the earth itself endured quiet, patient, eternal. In the mountains, shepherds still led their flocks as their ancestors had done 1,000 years before. In the valleys, farmers still pressed their hands into the soil. Children still played beside rivers, their laughter timeless as the wind. History is often written in the language of power, of kings and wars and conquests. But beneath that, there is a softer story, one that flows like water, the story of life continuing, unbroken. As the centuries turned, Alexander of Macedon began to rise, a prince from a small kingdom, dreaming of a world united. His armies would march east, carrying Greek language, art, and philosophy to the farthest lands. His vision was one of blending, of mixing cultures, of bridging worlds. When he reached Persia, he did not destroy Persepolis at first. He admired it. He walked its halls in silence, tracing the carved faces of kings who had ruled long before him, though history remembers him for his battles. There was also a strange tenderness in his ambition, the belief that all peoples could share in one horizon. After his passing, that dream scattered into fragments. His generals divided his empire, and new kingdoms rose from the pieces. Egypt became home to the Ptolemies. In Asia, the Seleucids built their own cities, where Greek and Eastern worlds intertwined, and through that mingling, something beautiful was born. The Hellenistic age. Art became softer, more human. Statues no longer stood rigid, but moved and breathed. Faces showed emotion, tenderness, grief. Libraries grew, the most famous in Alexandria, where scrolls lined the walls in countless languages. Scholars there tried to gather all knowledge under one roof, an impossible but deeply human dream. Outside the library, the city's harbor glimmered with light from the great lighthouse, the Pharos guiding ships safely through the dark, for sailors arriving after months at sea. That beam of light must have seemed like the gaze of heaven itself. And so, the world continued to turn. In Rome, the Republic grew in strength, guided by laws and debate. In China, the Qin dynasty began to unify the warring states under a single banner, its first emperor dreaming of eternity. In India, the Mauryan Empire blossomed under Ashoka, who turned from conquest to compassion, spreading words of peace etched in stone. Everywhere, the same truth shimmered, that humanity, though divided by lands and languages, was learning slowly, gently to see itself as one. The Iron Age was not merely an age of war and kings, it was an age of awakening. The earth, once ruled by beasts, now hummed with thought. Forests gave way to roads, silence gave way to song, and in the spaces between, the stars continued to shine, eternal witnesses to all that humans had built, and all that they still dreamed to become. As the night deepened, torches flickered in cities across the world, from Athens to Chang'an, from Babylon to Rome. The light of human curiosity glowed steady. Like embers in the dark dot, it was the light that would carry the world into its next age, the age of empire, of philosophy, and of faith. But for now, the Iron Age rested, the mountains stood calm, the seas breathed softly against the shores, and above them all, the constellations turned, silent and eternal. The earth was no longer young, yet it had never felt more alive. Asterisk. The Iron Age was slowly fading, its fires had burned bright, and their light had carried humanity far. But as centuries turned, the world began to settle into something gentler, a long exhalation after ages of restless building. Empires rose like waves, each cresting into brilliance before falling quietly back into the sea of time. Persia, Greece, Rome, their names would echo across the centuries. But even their grandeur was only a fleeting shimmer beneath the endless sky, and as each empire faded, new seeds were carried on the winds. Seeds of language, faith, and wonder. In the east, along the slow curve of the Yellow River, poets were beginning to look not toward conquest, but toward stillness. They saw beauty in the turning of the seasons, in the sound of wind through bamboo, in the quiet dignity of a single candle burning through the night. In India, under the shade of banyan trees, stories of compassion and renewal were shared by wandering monks. The world, they said, was an endless wheel, every soul returning again and again, learning in each lifetime how to love more deeply. To the west, beyond deserts and mountains, the Mediterranean world was alive with change. Rome's legions still marched, but within its walls, philosophers, artists, and dreamers shaped new ways of seeing the human soul. The poet Virgil wrote of a hero's journey, not as a conquest, but as a longing for home. Historians like Livy looked back upon their ancestors not as gods, but as people who had struggled, loved, and failed, and who, in their striving, had given meaning to the world. Farther north, in lands still wrapped in mist, Celtic tribes tended fires that burned through endless winters. They sang softly to the spirits of earth and sky, whispering to the stones and streams as though speaking to old friends. In Africa, kingdoms thrived along the Nile, and beyond the Sahara, caravans crossed the desert like drifting stars, carrying salt, gold, and stories. In the savannas, drums echoed like heartbeats, marking time the way rivers marked the land, slow, steady, eternal. And in the farthest reaches of the Americas, unseen by the empires across the ocean, new civilizations were quietly blooming. In the valleys of the Andes, people built terraces that clung to mountainsides, and watched the sun rise through perfectly aligned stones. All across the planet, humanity had learned to shape the earth in its image. But in every place, beneath every city and temple and field, the earth still breathed its ancient rhythm, a heartbeat older than all of history. As the centuries passed, something began to change within the human heart. Where once survival had been the only dream, now there was yearning for beauty, for understanding, for something beyond the visible world. People began to paint not only what they saw, but what they felt. They began to sing of gods and heavens, of lives beyond this one. It was as if humanity, after millennia of building, finally looked up and saw the sky for the first time. The Roman Empire stretched across continents, its roads reaching farther than any before. In the great cities, aqueducts whispered with flowing water, and amphitheaters rang with laughter and song. But in the countryside, life remained much as it had always been, quiet, rhythmic, simple. Farmers rose with the dawn, watched the mists burn away over the fields, and worked until dusk. Children chased each other among olive trees. Shepherds watched their flocks beneath a deepening sky. In those moments, the world seemed timeless. The empire, the armies, the laws, all felt distant, like waves breaking far from shore. The true story of humanity was not written in marble or ink. It was carried in breath, in heartbeat, in the soft murmur of rivers flowing to the sea. And as the years unfolded, new voices rose from the dust. In the hills of Judea, a teacher spoke of kindness and forgiveness, of loving one another as oneself. His words, gentle and enduring, spread slowly across the Roman world, like the glow of dawn across a dark sea. In deserts to the east, nomads looked to the stars and traced the will of heaven across constellations. In temples of sandstone and gold, priests lit lamps at dusk, their light a fragile echo of creation itself. The old gods began to fade, not in defeat, but in transformation. Faith took new forms, carrying the same eternal longing for peace, for purpose, for meaning. Everywhere, the world was shifting. Empires crumbled, but wisdom endured. Stone broke, but stories lived on. When Rome finally fell, it was not a thunderclap, but a sigh, the slow settling of an age that had carried humanity farther than any before. The lights of its cities dimmed, and for a while, the world grew quieter. But even in that quiet, the earth continued its endless song. In forests, monks copied ancient texts by candlelight. In distant deserts, traders followed stars across the dunes. In hidden valleys, small communities tended gardens, raised children, and watched the sun rise each day as their ancestors had done. And so, even as the great empires vanished, life endured, soft, steady, undiminished. In time, new worlds would rise. The Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, all still ahead. But beneath them all, the same thread continued, the unbroken line of life itself, weaving through the ruins and into tomorrow. If one were to stand at night on some quiet hill and look across the darkened plains of the ancient world, one might see tiny flickers of fire, small lights where people gathered, as they always had, for warmth and for story. Those lights, fragile though they seemed, were eternal. They were the light of human endurance, the glow of memory, of wonder. And somewhere deep beneath those same stars, the earth, this patient, ancient world, kept turning. The mountains that once trembled beneath meteors now stood calm and eternal. The oceans that had boiled after the asteroid now mirrored the heavens with perfect stillness. Forests had returned, seas had filled again with life, and from dust, humankind had risen, curious, imperfect, and full of longing. It was, perhaps, the greatest story ever told. The story of a planet that refused to surrender. From flame to stone, from ruin to rebirth, from silence to song, Earth had endured it all. And even now, though our cities glitter and our machines hum, that same ancient heartbeat still echoes beneath our feet. If you listen closely, beyond the noise of the modern world, beyond the hum of distant roads, you can still hear it. The pulse of time, the whisper of wind over old mountains, the sigh of waves that have seen everything come and go. This is the story that never ends. The story of survival, of renewal, of gentle persistence. And as you rest now, letting this story fade into dream, remember you are part of it. To dot the same atoms that once burned in stars, that once walked as dinosaurs, that once bloomed as flowers beside ancient rivers, they live in you. You are the continuation of Earth's great unfolding, a single note in its endless song. So let the world grow quiet now. Let the long rhythm of history dissolve into breath. Let the stars drift softly overhead, keeping their silent watch. The story of Earth continues, always in silence, in dream, in the soft turning of the world beneath your sleep. Asterisk.